The Nephilim, the forbidden giants before the flood. Imagine waking up one morning in the world you knew. The sky, the ground, the people around you had been quietly invaded, not by armies, not by nations, but by something that defied every law of nature and heaven itself. Now imagine that this didn't happen in a movie. It didn't happen in a myth. According to one of the oldest texts ever written, it happened to our world, long before recorded history, long before civilization as we know it. 4 verses, that's all we have. 4 short verses buried in the 6th chapter of Genesis. And yet, those 4 verses may describe one of the most terrifying events in all of human history. What were the Nephilim? Where did they come from? And why did their existence trigger a flood that wiped nearly all life on the face of the earth? Stay with me, because by the end of this, the ancient world is never going to look the same again. Here is what we know. Before the great flood of Noah, the Bible records that beings called the Nephilim walked the earth. They are described as mighty, as legendary, as men of renown. But who were they really? Were they simply large, powerful warrior kings, unusually tall men who were in fearsome reputations? Or were they something far more disturbing, the offspring of a union between fallen angels and human women? And if that second answer is even partially true, what does that mean for everything we thought we understood about the story of creation, the fall of mankind, and the reason God sent the flood? 3 questions will drive our journey tonight. Who were the sons of God in Genesis 6? What were the Nephilim? And why does Jesus himself refer back to the days of Noah as a warning for the end of time? The answers are older than civilization, and they are stranger than you might expect. To understand Nephilim, we first have to understand the world they lived in. After Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, human civilization began to grow. Generations multiplied. Families became clans. Clans became communities. The earth began to fill, just as God had commanded. By the time we reach Genesis chapter 6, centuries have passed. The descendants of Adam have spread across the land, and among them, 2 distinct lines have emerged. The line of Seth, Adam's 3rd son, who the Bible describes as a generation through which people began to call on the name of God, and the line of Cain, Adam's firstborn, the one who murdered his brother Abel and was cursed to wander. Cain's descendants, according to Genesis 4, became builders of cities, inventors of tools, and creators of music. Brilliant, driven, but spiritually adrift. These 2 lines lived side by side, and as they did, something began to shift. Cain's descendants were not merely godless. They were violent. The text records a man named Lamech, a descendant of Cain, boasting openly that he killed a man simply for wounding him. He compared himself to his ancestor and said his vengeance would be 77 times greater. This was the moral atmosphere of the pre-flood world. Power celebrated, mercy forgotten, pride unchecked. And it was into this atmosphere that Genesis 6 introduces something that changes everything. Genesis 6, verse 1 and 2. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives to themselves of all they chose. That phrase, sons of God, has been debated for centuries. The first interpretation, and perhaps the safer one, is that the sons of God were simply the godly descendants of Seth, righteous men from Adam's holy line, and the daughters of men were women from the ungodly line of Cain. On this view, Genesis 6 is describing a collapse of spiritual boundaries. The faithful married the faithless. The godly line corrupted itself through intermarriage with the wicked, and the result was a generation so spiritually degraded that God grieved he had ever made them. This interpretation is clean. It's simple. It keeps everything within the natural world. But there are problems with it. If this was simply intermarriage between 2 human groups, why did it produce giants? Why would godly men marrying ungodly women result in beings described as legendary, mighty, and extraordinary? People marry across religious lines every day. It doesn't produce a race of superhuman warriors. And more importantly, why would this particular event trigger a global flood? Spiritually mixed marriages were common throughout the Old Testament. God judged nations for it. But he never responded with a planet-wide catastrophe. Something bigger was happening. The second interpretation takes the phrase sons of God at full face value, and it leads somewhere far darker. In the book of Job, the sons of God appear twice. In both cases, they are heavenly beings, spiritual entities presenting themselves before the throne of God, not humans, angels. The ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint, actually uses the word angels in place of sons of God in Genesis 6. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the angels who descended to earth took human women as wives. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran, contain an entire document called the Book of Giants, detailing the exploits of the Nephilim as enormous, destructive beings born of these unions. These were not fringe interpretations. For hundreds of years, many Jewish and early Christian scholars read Genesis 6 and saw something supernatural. And then the New Testament adds a piece that is almost impossible to ignore. The book of Jude, verse 6. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Left their proper domain. That is an extraordinarily specific statement. What domain did these angels abandon? What boundary did they cross that warranted being chained in eternal darkness? The very next verse in Jude references Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed for going after strange flesh. The parallel is intentional. Jude appears to be saying that just as Sodom violated natural boundaries, so did these angels. If Jude is referencing Genesis 6, then what happened before the flood was not intermarriage. It was invasion. Genesis says the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took wives of all they chose. Took of all they chose. There is a possessive, dominating energy in those words. This was not courtship. This was not love. This was conquest. And the result of that conquest was recorded in Genesis 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The word Nephilim, ancient, heavy. Scholars trace it to the Hebrew root naphal, meaning to fall, the fallen ones. Some interpret it as those who cause others to fall, beings whose very presence brought ruin on everything around them, men of renown. In the original Hebrew, the word is Shem, name. These were beings whose names were legendary across the ancient world, whose deeds were spoken of in awe and terror. And here is something that should stop you in your tracks. Across virtually every ancient culture on Earth, cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of miles, there are stories of demigods, half human, half divine beings of extraordinary size and power. The Greeks told of the Titans and the heroes, Hercules, Achilles, Perseus, offspring of gods and mortal women. The Mesopotamians recorded the Anunnaki, divine beings who descended from the heavens and mingled with humanity. The Sumerians wrote of Gilgamesh, a king who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, of superhuman size and strength. The Egyptians spoke of their pharaohs as descended from the gods themselves. The Norse myths give us the giants, the Jotnar, who existed before the age of men and warred with the divine. These stories are too consistent across too many cultures to be pure coincidence. Something in the ancient human memory, something old and traumatic, seems to echo across all of these traditions. And Genesis 6 may be the source memory that all of them distorted over time. Now imagine what that world looked like. Beings of enormous power walking among ordinary humans, dominating through size and strength, inspiring reverence and terror. Violence not just normalized but celebrated, embodied in the very beings who ruled. Genesis 6 verse 11 says the earth was filled with violence, not partial violence, not localized violence. The earth, the whole of it, saturated with it. Something had gone deeply, catastrophically wrong. If this is gripping you the way it's gripping me, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in the South? The Midwest? Out on the West Coast? Let me see where my people are. Comment right now with your state or city. I read every single one. Genesis 6 verse 12 delivers a verse that is easy to read past, but absolutely staggering in its implications. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, For all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. All flesh, not some, not most, all. Now, if this corruption was simply moral, wicked behavior, violence, spiritual rebellion, we would expect the text to say that humanity had corrupted itself. But the phrase is all flesh. That is an unusual construction. It encompasses more than just human moral failure. Some scholars, particularly those who hold to the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6, argue that this phrase points to something biological. If angelic beings had truly crossed a boundary into the physical world and fathered offspring with human women, then the very genetic fabric of humanity may have been under attack. This sounds strange to modern ears, but consider the larger story of Scripture. Back in Genesis 3, verse 15, immediately after the fall of Adam and Eve, God makes a promise. He speaks directly to the serpent, to Satan, and says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Her seed, a descendant of the woman, would come, and that descendant would crush the head of the serpent. This is the first prophecy of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, embedded in the very first chapters of the Bible. The entire plan of redemption hinges on a human bloodline remaining intact, a pure line through which the Redeemer would eventually be born. If Satan understood that prophecy, and Scripture suggests he did, then corrupting the human bloodline becomes a strategic objective, not random cruelty, not mere rebellion, a targeted assault on the lineage that would eventually produce the one who would destroy him. If the Nephilim were the offspring of fallen angels and human women, then the corruption of all flesh may have been progressing toward a point where no fully human bloodline remained. And if that happened, the promised Redeemer could never come. The flood, from this angle, looks different. It was not only punishment, it was protection. God was not just judging wickedness. He was preserving the possibility of salvation itself. And then we come to one man. Genesis 6 verse 8 says simply, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." That word but carries the entire weight of history on its back. The world is corrupt. All flesh has been defiled. Judgment is coming. But Noah, verse 9 describes him this way. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God, perfect in his generations. That phrase has been the subject of enormous debate. Most English translations interpret it as morally blameless, a description of Noah's character. And that interpretation is certainly supported by the text. Noah was righteous. He walked with God. He obeyed when no one else did. But the word for generations in Hebrew is toldoth, and it can carry a meaning related to lineage, to descent, to bloodline. Some scholars argue that this phrase is saying something dual, that Noah was not only morally upright, but that his lineage was genetically intact, uncorrupted, pure in the line of Adam, all the way back to creation. Whether you hold that interpretation or not, the result is the same. God chose Noah. And through Noah, God chose to restart the human story. God instructs Noah to build an ark. The dimensions given are enormous, over 400 feet long, a vessel of a kind no one had ever constructed. And Noah builds it. For 120 years, according to some interpretations of the text, Noah works. The people around him mock. They eat and drink and marry. They live as though nothing is coming. The mighty men of renown may have still walked the earth during those years. The violence may have continued to escalate. The corruption may have deepened. And Noah builds. Finally, Genesis 7 verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Rain, for 40 days and 40 nights. The text says the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. Every high hill under the whole heaven was covered. 15 cubits above the mountains the waters rose. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to climb, nowhere to hide, and the giants fell with everyone else. The mighty men of renown, whose names had echoed across the ancient world, they drowned. Their bodies sank. Their empires vanished beneath miles of water, and the world that had been was gone. 8 people stepped off the ark onto a cleansed earth. Noah and his wife, their 3 sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. 8 survivors. The entire human race, reduced to a family standing on a mountain with mud drying on the ground beneath their feet. God made a covenant with Noah. He set a rainbow in the sky as a sign. He promised never again to destroy the earth by flood. And humanity began again. But then, and this is the part that unsettles everything, the giants appear again, centuries after the flood, when Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan. They come back with a terrifying report. Numbers 13:33. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. Grasshoppers. That is not metaphor. These spies were describing a genuine, paralyzing terror at the size of what they saw. How did the Nephilim survive the flood? Some scholars argue that the phrase the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and also afterward, in Genesis 6 verse 4 suggests that the incursion happened more than once, that whatever produced the Nephilim before the flood occurred again after it. Others argue that the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the other giant clans mentioned throughout the Old Testament were simply extraordinarily large human tribes, descendants of men, not of fallen angels, whose fearsome reputation got tangled up in the ancient mythology of the Nephilim. And then there is Goliath, the Philistine champion who stood over 9 feet tall and wore armor weighing over 125 pounds, who mocked the armies of Israel for 40 days, who was brought down not by a warrior, but by a shepherd boy with a stone and a sling. Was Goliath connected to the Nephilim? The text links him to Gath, a city associated with the remnant of the Rephaim, one of the giant clans. His brothers are described elsewhere in Samuel as also being men of great stature. The Bible does not draw the line with perfect clarity, but the thread is there, running from Genesis 6 all the way through to the time of David. Something about the ancient world was not fully extinguished by the flood. And then Jesus speaks. In Matthew chapter 24, his disciples ask him what the sign of his coming and the end of the age will be. And Jesus gives them a detailed answer: wars, famines, earthquakes, persecution, false prophets. And then this: as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man: eating and drinking, marrying, going about ordinary life with no awareness that the world is about to change forever. Most people read this as a warning about complacency, and it is, absolutely. But there are those who wonder if Jesus was saying something more. If the days of Noah were marked not only by moral wickedness, but by a specific kind of spiritual corruption, fallen beings operating in the physical world, boundaries being crossed that were never meant to be crossed, could Jesus be hinting that a similar pattern will emerge before his return? The book of Revelation speaks of things coming upon the earth that defy easy natural explanation. Paul writes of spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. Daniel describes a time of trouble unlike any that has ever been. The days of Noah were a convergence. Human sin at its peak, supernatural rebellion at its most brazen, and divine intervention at its most decisive. And Jesus says, watch for it again. The Nephilim remain one of the most contested mysteries in all of Scripture. 4 verses, centuries of debate, scholars who disagree sharply, ancient texts that seem to confirm the darkest interpretations, New Testament passages that open more questions than they close. Were they the offspring of fallen angels and human women, hybrid beings that corrupted the very biological foundation of the human race? Were they simply powerful warlords whose legends grew into mythology? Were they a combination of both, real human tyrants who were spiritually possessed and supernaturally empowered? The Bible does not give us a clean, final answer, and I think that is intentional, because the mystery is not the point. The point is this: darkness rose to a level that threatened the survival of everything God had made and everything God had promised. And God responded, with judgment, yes, but also with grace. He found one man, one family. He preserved them through catastrophe. He made a covenant. He kept his promise. And thousands of years later, through the very bloodline that the flood protected, through the line of Shem, through Abraham, through David, the promised seed was born in a stable in Bethlehem. The giants are gone. The flood waters have long since receded. But the spiritual battle that Genesis 6 describes, the contest between darkness and the purposes of God, that battle is not ended, and history tells us which side wins. The ark held, the line continued, the promise was kept. Whatever darkness rises, and it will rise, it has never once succeeded in canceling the purposes of God, and it never will. Now I want to hear from you, right now, in the comments below. Do you believe the Nephilim were supernatural beings, or were they simply powerful human warriors whose stories grew larger with time? There is no wrong answer. This is a 2,000-year-old debate, and brilliant minds have landed on every side of it. Tell me where you stand. I am reading every comment. And if this kind of deep dive into the ancient mysteries of Scripture is something you want more of, the stories hiding in plain sight inside the oldest book ever written, then make sure you're subscribed. Because next time, we go somewhere that will shake you just as much as this one. Hit the like button if this opens something up for you tonight. Share it with someone who loves history, who loves Scripture, who loves asking the questions that don't have easy answers. Thank you for listening this far. God bless you as hit that subscribe button. And if you want to make vids like this, click the link in the description. Bye for now.